Let me tell you about the most controversial thing Christianity ever did. And it is not what you think. It was not the Crusades, although those were genuinely terrible. It was not the Inquisition, although that was also genuinely terrible. It was not the scandals, the corruption, the centuries of institutional failure that gave critics everything they needed to dismiss the whole project as hopelessly hypocritical. The most controversial thing Christianity ever did was spread, not violently. That happened too, and we are going to talk about it. But the actual core controversy, the thing that has made Christian missionaries the most argued about group of people in the history of religion, is something far more complicated than violence. It is the question of what happens when one set of beliefs about ultimate reality encounters a completely different culture that has been doing perfectly fine, or at least functioning, with its own set of beliefs about ultimate reality, and decides that it has something those people need to hear. That question does not have a clean answer. It never has. It is a question that sits at the intersection of theology, anthropology, history, power, identity, and the deeply human need to share what you believe to be true with people who do not yet know it. And here is what I find genuinely fascinating about it. After watching this particular argument play out across more centuries than most people can comfortably imagine, both sides of the debate consistently manage to miss the most important thing. The people who say Christian evangelization was pure cultural imperialism, nothing more than religious colonialism dressed up in the language of love, miss the fact that the gospel has consistently been translated, adapted, and re-expressed in so many different cultural forms that it is genuinely impossible to point to a single original culture that it represents. Christianity looks different in Seoul than it does in Lagos, than it does in Sao Paulo, than it does in rural Alabama. That range is not a mistake. It is the result of 2,000 years of a message that has repeatedly proven capable of finding new forms in new contexts. The people who say Christian evangelization was pure and noble, and whatever cultural disruption it caused was a small price to pay for eternal truth, miss the fact that some of what got lost in those disruptions, languages, practices, identities, ways of understanding the world that had taken generations to develop, was genuinely valuable, and that the loss was real and lasting and not something that can simply be waved away with reference to eternal consequences. Today, we are going to sit with both of those things at the same time, because the real story is only visible when you refuse to choose a side before you have actually heard the whole argument. The first major recorded encounter between the Christian message and a fully developed non-Jewish culture is one of the most remarkable scenes in the entire New Testament, and most people who know the story do not fully appreciate how radical it was in its original context. Acts chapter 17. Paul is in Athens, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, a city whose entire identity was built around philosophy, debate, the pursuit of knowledge, and a religious culture that involved worship of dozens of different deities through dozens of different rituals. The Athenians, the text tells us, spent their time doing nothing but discussing and hearing new ideas. It was a culture defined by intellectual curiosity and a kind of cheerful religious pluralism that said essentially, we are not sure which gods are real, so we cover all our bases, and if you have a god we have not heard of, bring them to our collection. Paul, walking through the city, notices an altar dedicated to an unknown god. And when he gets the chance to address the Athenians directly at the Areopagus, the philosophical council where new ideas were formally evaluated, he does something that had not been done before and would not become standard Christian practice for a very long time afterward. He does not begin with the Hebrew scriptures. He does not begin with Jewish religious history. He begins with their own culture. He quotes their own poets. He uses their altar to an unknown god as a bridge rather than a target. He says, in effect, the thing you have been worshiping without knowing what it was. That is what I am here to tell you about. This approach has a name. In contemporary theological discussion, it is called inculturation, the practice of finding points of genuine connection between the gospel message and the cultural frameworks of the people hearing it, rather than requiring those people to adopt an entirely foreign cultural form before they can access the message itself. Paul's speech in Athens is the original model for this approach, and it is worth noting that it had mixed results. Some people believed, most mocked, a few wanted to hear more. That is not the triumphant narrative of mass conversion that later generations of missionaries sometimes projected onto their work. It is the honest record of a message meeting a sophisticated culture and finding some genuine resonance alongside a fair amount of polite dismissal. What Paul did in Athens set a template. What happened to that template across the next 2,000 years is one of the most complicated stories in human religious history. I am not going to soften this section. The history of Christian evangelization includes episodes of genuine, documented, serious harm to the cultures it encountered, and those episodes deserve to be named directly rather than handled with careful theological language that makes them easier to set aside. In Latin America, the Spanish conquest came with priests. The physical destruction of indigenous religious sites, the forced conversion of populations under threat of violence, the burning of codices, manuscripts that contained the accumulated knowledge, history, and religious understanding of entire civilizations. These were not isolated incidents committed by rogue actors. They were systematic, they were often officially sanctioned, and they were justified at the time using the language of saving souls. In Africa, European missionaries frequently arrived ahead of or alongside colonial governments, and the version of Christianity they brought was often inseparable from the assumption that African cultures were primitive and needed to be civilized before they could be properly Christianized. Traditional practices that had sustained communities for generations, burial rituals, naming ceremonies, systems of communal identity, were condemned as pagan superstition and suppressed, sometimes violently, sometimes simply through the sustained social pressure of institutions that controlled education, medical care, and other resources communities needed. In North America, the residential school system, operated in the United States and Canada largely by Christian denominations, took indigenous children from their families, forbade them from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions, and used physical punishment to enforce compliance. The last of these schools did not close until the 1990s in Canada. People who survived them are still alive today. These are not comfortable facts to hold alongside the genuine good that individual missionaries did. The schools built, the hospitals opened, the languages documented and preserved by the same people who were simultaneously condemning the cultures those languages expressed. Both things are true, and holding both of them simultaneously without collapsing into either pure condemnation or pure defense is the only honest position available. Here is the theological question that haunts all of this, and that serious Christian thinkers have wrestled with honestly for decades. If the message is true and genuinely important, does that justify the means used to deliver it? And if the means were harmful enough, does that change something about how the message itself is understood? Those questions do not have easy answers. Anyone who tells you they do is selling you something. Having said all of that, and meaning all of it, I also need to tell you about the other side of this history, because it is just as real and just as documented and receives far less attention in contemporary conversations about religion and culture. The translation of the Bible into local languages is one of the most significant forces for cultural preservation in human history, and it runs directly counter to the narrative that Christian evangelization was uniformly hostile to indigenous cultures. When missionaries learned a local language well enough to translate scripture into it, they were doing several things simultaneously. They were creating the first written form of languages that had previously existed only in oral tradition, which is not a small thing. Writing a language down is the act that makes it possible to preserve it across generations and catastrophes. They were producing literary works in those languages that became cultural touchstones. And they were implicitly affirming that the language itself was worthy of carrying the most important message the missionary believed could be communicated, which is a form of respect that cuts against the claim that all missionaries viewed indigenous cultures as merely inferior. The Ethiopian Church has maintained continuous Christian practice since the 4th century, preserving a distinct cultural and theological tradition that is not Western, not Roman, not Greek. It is Ethiopian, shaped by Ethiopian language, art, music, and social organization in ways that have no equivalent anywhere else in the world. Christianity in Korea, which was adopted voluntarily and grew without Western missionary domination in many of its early stages, has developed a distinct Korean character that includes forms of prayer, worship, and community organization that draw on indigenous cultural traditions in genuine ways. In West Africa, theologians have spent decades developing what is called African theology, a systematic engagement with Christian thought through the lens of African philosophical traditions, ancestral spirituality frameworks, and communal understandings of human identity that differ fundamentally from Western individualism. This is not syncretism for its own sake. It is the same work Paul was doing in Athens, finding the genuine points where a universal message and a particular culture can speak to each other honestly. The Gospel's track record across cultures, taken as a whole, is not the story of a single culture absorbing all others into its image. It is the story of a message that has repeatedly proven capable of becoming something new in each new context while retaining a recognizable core. And that capacity is either one of the most remarkable facts about Christian history or one of the most suspicious ones, depending entirely on how you choose to evaluate it. Here is the question that sits at the center of every serious debate about evangelization and culture, and that nobody has managed to answer cleanly in 2,000 years of trying. Where is the line between genuine cultural adaptation and the kind of compromise that changes the message itself? Paul quoted Athenian poets and found a bridge in an altar to an unknown god. But he also, later in the same speech, said things about judgment and resurrection that caused some of those same Athenians to walk away mocking. He adapted his approach. He did not adapt the core content. But what is core content and what is cultural packaging? This question has split Christian communities more times than most people can count. When Jesuit missionaries in China in the 16th and 17th centuries argued that the Chinese practice of ancestor veneration was compatible with Christian faith, that it was a cultural expression of honor and community memory rather than actual worship of the dead, Rome eventually disagreed and forbade it, in a decision that many historians believe set back the growth of Christianity in China by centuries. When contemporary African theologians argue that certain traditional practices around community, healing, and the relationship between the living and the dead can be reframed within a Christian framework rather than simply condemned, some Western Christians hear genuine theological insight, and some hear dangerous compromise. The disagreement is not primarily about those specific practices. It is about who gets to define what is essential and what is cultural packaging. This argument runs through almost every major Christian controversy of the last 500 years. The Reformation was, among other things, a dispute about which elements of medieval European Catholic culture were essential gospel and which were cultural accretion. Liberation theology in Latin America was, among other things, a dispute about whether the gospel has something specific to say about poverty and power or whether its message is purely individual and spiritual. The contemporary global church is, among other things, a vast ongoing argument about which of the assumptions baked into Western Christianity over 2,000 years are actually universal and which are simply Western. Nobody has settled this argument. The honest answer is that nobody is going to settle it, because the argument itself is one of the things that keeps the tradition alive, constantly being re-examined, constantly being challenged by new contexts that refuse to simply accept the version of the message that arrived with the last wave of missionaries. Here is something that most people in the West do not know, and that changes the entire frame of the conversation about Christianity and culture. Christianity is no longer a Western religion. It has not been for decades, in terms of where the majority of its adherents actually live. The center of gravity of global Christianity has shifted decisively to the global South, to sub-Saharan Africa, to Latin America, to parts of Asia, and that shift is not slowing down. It is accelerating. There are more Christians in Nigeria than in any country in Western Europe. There are more Christians in Brazil than in any country in North America. The fastest-growing Christian communities in the world are not in the United States or Germany or the United Kingdom. They are in Ethiopia, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in China, in South Korea, in the Philippines. What this means for the conversation about evangelization and culture is significant. The assumption that runs through most Western critiques of Christian evangelization, that it represents a Western cultural project imposing itself on non-Western cultures, is increasingly difficult to maintain when the religion's most dynamic expressions are being led by non-Western Christians who are developing their own theological frameworks, their own worship styles, their own missionary movements, and their own critiques of the Western Christianity that originally brought the gospel to their regions. Nigerian Pentecostal missionaries are evangelizing in Europe. South Korean missionaries are among the largest national contingents of Christian missionaries worldwide. The Chinese house church movement, developed under decades of government suppression without any Western institutional support, has produced some of the most theologically serious and culturally distinct forms of Christian practice in the world. The story of Christianity and culture is not over. It is not even close to over. And the next chapters of that story are going to be written primarily in languages that are not English, by communities that do not share the cultural assumptions that shaped the first 1,500 years of the tradition's history. Let me tell you where I land on this, after walking you through 2,000 years of the most complicated religion and culture conversation in human history. The message at the center of Christian evangelization, that there is a God who is interested in human beings, who entered human history in a specific person at a specific moment, and that this has implications for how people treat each other and what happens after they die, is either true or it is not. I have a view on that question, as you might expect. But whatever you believe about the truth of the message, the history of how it has been communicated across cultures is a human history, full of the full range of what humans do when they believe something deeply and want other people to believe it too. That range includes coercion and genuine love. It includes the destruction of irreplaceable cultural heritage and the preservation of languages that would otherwise have been lost. It includes missionaries who saw indigenous people as children to be civilized and missionaries who learned those people's languages, ate their food, defended them against colonial governments, and spent their lives genuinely trying to understand how the message they carried might find authentic expression in a completely different cultural form. Here is what I want you to take from this, regardless of where you personally stand on the theological questions underneath it. When any message, religious, political, philosophical, crosses a cultural boundary, it faces a choice that is never fully clean. It can refuse to adapt, insisting that the packaging and the content are inseparable, and in doing so preserve the message's integrity at the cost of it being genuinely heard by people who cannot receive it in that form. Or it can adapt so thoroughly to each new context that it loses whatever made it worth crossing the boundary to share in the first place. The best moments in the history of Christian evangelization, Paul in Athens, the Ethiopian church developing its own distinct theological tradition, Korean Christianity finding forms of community that resonate with Korean cultural values, African theology engaging seriously with African philosophical traditions.